Welcome back to the Grass Toucher channel. I am an adult man and I'm here today to talk to you about the magic of older video games. And before we go ahead and kick this video off, I've got a couple of questions for you guys. Do you ever find yourself reminiscing about older games that you've played when you were younger? Do you feel like modern games are missing some kind of magic, for lack of a better term? Do you think that looking back fondly on older games that you used to enjoy is a product of pure nostalgia, or do you think that there's something more to it? At least for me, when I look back on my younger and more formative years, spending hours and hours playing through my favorite games at that time, I can't help but get this feeling that playing those games evoked a certain sense of magic and fun that I just can't really seem to replicate too well with most modern titles these days. And I think I speak for all of us when I say this, but there was a special feeling of sitting there on the carpeted floor in my tighty-whities playing Super Mario 64 on a Saturday morning that needs to be explored. So today we'll be diving into what made those older games so much more fun and memorable to us, or if there was any special feeling playing them at all. We'll take a look at some of the key differences between both modern titles and older games, ultimately trying to uncover if older games were actually more special and different and, dare I say, better, or if it's just the rose-tinted goggles of nostalgia making us think that way. Also, just a quick call out for the purposes of this video, when I say older games, I'm mostly referring to titles from like the mid-90s to the mid to late 2000s. I know that's kind of a big range, but bear with me. All right, any questions?
When was the last time you trimmed your nose hair?
Good. Now let's go. No video essay that has older video games as its subject is ever even close to complete without tackling the all too popular subject of nostalgia. Nostalgia is one of those things in the gaming community that is brought up more often than the question of whether or not my eyebrows are actually two caterpillars stuck to my face. And like my eyebrows, there's no doubt that nostalgia can be a very powerful thing. Or things. It can make us look back at the past with both a fondness and a yearning for things to be the way that they used to. It typically can warp our memories into thinking that things were just always better back in the good old days. Feels so weird doing this. It tends to kind of make us like laser focused on the really good things about the past, or at least how we remember them as being really good, and completely disregard anything that was even close to being bad or inconvenient. And for some reason, and I'm guilty of this too, when it comes to gaming and nostalgia, the effects of nostalgia seem to be amplified by 100 times. Now come with me. Let's take a trip way back to when I was just a wee lad. So I remember spending what felt like thousands of hours playing through Pokemon Blue version on my first ever Game Boy that I had as a child. I remember feeling the thrill of adventure, traveling through arduous landscapes and beautiful terrain as I set out on this long and epic quest, collecting gym badge after gym badge, all on my path to become the Pokemon leader, or whatever you do in Pokemon games. Is it? You beat the Elite Four, right? In my mind's eye, I strongly remembered the feeling of intense battles, the required use of masterful tactics, and the sheer difficulty of me conquering every obstacle in my path, battle after battle on my way to Victory Road. I also remember getting slapped around by Lance's Dragonite like over and over and over again, and like crying about it to my mom because I was so pissed off. In my memory, Pokemon Blue was one of the most interesting, fun, and magical experiences that gaming has ever had to offer. So I did what any adult man born in the early 90s would do. I found my old cartridge, dusted it off, and went ahead and started out a brand new journey straight from Pallet Town. I met Professor Oak, I went ahead and chose my first starter Pokemon, set off on my adventure, and it was, Fucking awful. And most of that has to do with the fact that I'm not 8 years old anymore, and that this was in fact a game released back in 1998, but going back and playing Pokemon Blue again wasn't as fun, grand, interesting, or as magical as I thought it would be. Without going into too much detail, it was a lot slower and just a lot more boring than I had remembered it being. It was also like way more simple than I remembered it being as a kid. Shout out to Pokemon Red and Blue though, still gotta put respect on the name there, still has a special place in my heart. Anyway, the whole point of that Pokemon example was to illustrate the fact that whenever older video games come up in the subject of conversation or a YouTube video essay, it's often argued that nostalgia is the main, if not only, reason that we look back on older titles with any sense of admiration. And when it comes to me with Pokemon Blue, for example, that was definitely the case. But what about when that isn't the case? It's true that many of you watching this, myself included, grew up playing these games during our more formative years as kids and when our imagination and sense of wonder was at its peak. But what about older games like Super Mario 64, for example?
Let's go.
Or The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, or one of my personal favorites, Metal Gear Solid 2, Sons of Liberty. These games are amazing older titles that could definitely go toe-to-toe with some of the more popular modern games released in current day. And also just really quick on that note, I went back and played a bunch of older titles that I actually never played when I was younger, just to see if I could rule out that nostalgia factor for this video. And probably no surprise, but a lot of those titles ended up holding up and were really good games even for modern standards. Okay, so I actually wrote down the list of games that I played for this video. We've got Majora's Mask, complete banger. Sly Cooper, total humdinger there. Kingdom Hearts 1, Giga Steamer. Time Splitters 2, really fucking good game. Warcraft 3, so I actually did play this, but I didn't play the campaigns fully. Unequivocal banger. And that's just a few that I wrote down. All of this is to say that nostalgia is something that I feel like should be acknowledged, and it can definitely play a factor in making us remember and making us feel like older games had a more magical feeling to them. There's definitely still some legitimacy to the claim that older games were a little bit more magical or even a little bit more fun or interesting, even when we take nostalgia out of the equation. All right, putting the nostalgia piece on the back burner for a quick sec. Nope, okay, I actually need that. I didn't remember the next part. There was definitely something in the air during that 90s and 2000s era that caused massive levels of creativity within anybody who was working in video games at that time. Some kind of thick, creeping, creative-inducing miasma that wafted through the office halls of wherever these game developers happened to be working, similar to the wafting miasma that comes through the halls of my apartment after I eat Chipotle for dinner. I'm not sure if it was the vapors emitting from the lead paint chipping off of the walls of where these people worked, or if most game development offices still had asbestos-lined ceilings, but developers back then seemed very willing and able to cook up some really creative and interesting stuff, especially when you take into consideration the limitations in technology that existed between then and now. Things like limited processing power, memory capacity, storage capacity, or graphical processing power, the lack of Popeyes having a chicken sandwich, or of Taco Bell having a giant Cheez-It Crunchwrap on the menu. Take Jet Set Radio, for example, which released on the Dreamcast console in the year 2000. It was the first game to take advantage of this new graphical technique called cell shading, which you may be familiar with from games like Wind Waker, Borderlands, or even Breath of the Wild or Genshin Impact. Cell shading is a highly stylized visual art form which uses computer processing power to give 3D models an almost 2D hand-drawn storybook appearance. This visual decision ended up being a lot of players' first introduction to a video game with such a vibrant, stylized, and colorful world that would have definitely killed a medieval peasant if someone were to travel back in time and show it to them. Jet Set Radio's visual, musical, and gameplay creativity, alongside its unique premise showcased the potential for artistic innovation within the world of video game design, standing in a league of its own at the time and paving the way for future games to take advantage and refine that cel shading technique and stepping outside the usual boundaries. An example of a game that was inspired by the cel shaded technique of Jet Set Radio was Okami, which utilized this style to great effect. And I'm slightly ashamed to admit that I have actually never played Okami in my life. I know, but I know that people are constantly talking about the beauty of its graphics and its fun gameplay and how it holds a special place in a lot of people's hearts, so I figured that I would go ahead and mention it so that I'm not attacked by everybody brutally in the comments. Okami is most widely known for using the cel shading technique to emulate a traditional Japanese ink painting style, creating both a stunning and timeless visual appearance, especially for a game of the PlayStation 2 era. The game's art direction wasn't just a stylistic choice, but was also a creative way to circumvent the PS2's graphical limitations while also delivering a really memorable and striking visual experience. And the reason why I bring that up is to shine a light on how the technical limitations of that era of game development really pushed developers to think outside of the box for certain things, and that thinking outside of the box is what helped give us those titles at that time that felt so much more memorable and impactful. Those limitations seemed to breed some kind of creativity that then translated into really unique and memorable gaming experiences and came to life in the most fun and magical ways. Switching gears a little bit to horror games, Silent Hill 2 is actually another great example. For those that have had the pleasure of playing this, especially back in the PS2 era on the actual console, you'll remember the atmosphere feeling perfectly curated, creating this crippling sense of dread and danger as you slowly crawled your way through this fog-filled town. And if you're like me, you may also remember shitting your pants at the first sight of this thing. That misty and creeping dense fog that seemed to stretch into every corner of the town and added to that foreboding feeling of that memorable atmosphere was actually a product of the technical limitations on the PS2 console. Due to the technical limitations on draw distance on the PS2 console, the Silent Hill 2 developers actually utilized that fog to limit the player's vision within a certain distance, ultimately creating one of the best survival horror atmospheres and digital laxatives to this day. That infamous fog didn't only mask the graphical constraints at the time, but became a defining feature of the series while enhancing that horror experience. Exposure to this game would have also definitely killed a medieval peasant instantly. Despite the various tech limitations and challenges at the time, developers were still able to provide the most unique, memorable, and beloved gaming experiences ever by keeping their focus on innovation and imaginative solutions. In this instance, that old notion that limitation breeds creativity actually holds true, especially in the context of older games. Working within limitations can lead to the most innovative and impactful results, which is a key component of why those older games had that feeling and sense of magic that doesn't seem to be as prevalent in modern gaming, especially in the AAA space. Now, while we're on the subject of graphics and creativity and all of that good stuff, I wanted to touch on another thing that I think made those older games feel like they had that sense of magic baked in them. And that's the focusing on creating unique and memorable art styles instead of solely focusing on pushing the limits of graphical fidelity. Now, not to open up a whole can of worms here, but graphical fidelity and art style are essentially two sides to the same metaphorical graphics coin. When I say graphical fidelity, what I mean is pushing the technical aspects of graphics to make them look close to or as realistic as possible. Essentially just making graphics look good. Shaders, lighting, polygons, textures, rendering power, other buzzwords that I don't really know about, all of that good stuff. Art style, on the other hand, is the artistic vision and visual design choice of the game. That'll encompass the overall aesthetics, the art direction, the character designs, colors, kind of like the overall visual theme that gives the game its unique look and feel. Unlike graphical fidelity, which is almost more about technical prowess, art style is about artistic direction, and it can vary widely based on the artistic choices that are made by the creators of the game. An example of a modern game with high graphical fidelity would be the Demon's Souls remake on the PS5. While it does have a stylized art direction, a lot of the focus is pushed on the technical prowess, quality, and realism of the visuals. And I've got to say, one of the coolest things about the Demon's Souls remake on the PS5 was the ability to see which direction each one of my character's ass hairs was blowing in the wind. Now that's detail. And on the other hand, an example of a modern game that has much more of a focus on art direction versus graphical fidelity would be something like Cuphead. The technical achievement of the graphics really isn't anything crazy, but the art style itself is strong, unique, and super memorable. It's the type of game with an art direction that really sticks with you and tends to stand out in a sea of very similar games in the genre. While devs certainly focused on pushing graphical fidelity back in the day, the technical limitations at the time meant that game creators couldn't rely on certain graphical effects like high-resolution textures or advanced lighting effects, for example, but instead they had to get more creative with their visuals. This led to a variety of artistic approaches, each with its unique charm and personality. For instance, The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker adopted and really honed in on that cel-shaded art style that I was mentioning earlier. It gave the game a super memorable and almost cartoon-like visual appearance, which was actually pretty divisive at the time. But I think in time, most people have really come around to the art style, and in general, it's remembered very fondly for its unique, artistic, and super expressive qualities. Similarly, Final Fantasy IX utilized a whimsical, almost storybook-like aesthetic that at the time stood in stark contrast to the more realistic focused style of its predecessors, creating a unique visual identity that perfectly matched its fantasy setting and burned itself into the mind's eye of every kid and teenager with a PS1 at the time. Taking this kind of approach allowed developers to craft distinctive visuals that have stood the test of time, setting these games apart from the increasingly homogeneous look of many of the modern AAA titles today. And I think the unique visual aesthetics of a lot of these games played a monumental part in how memorable and beloved they are today. And I also think that there's kind of some evidence for that. For those of you who have an Instagram account, you may have come across one of these posts. There's been a trend over the last year or two, and maybe longer, I could just be kind of out of the loop on these things, where people seem to kind of look back at this low poly PS1-ish era and yearn for the aesthetics of that time. And a lot of it is probably nostalgia, but I do think that there is something special about this art style that just brings out that feeling of magic inside of us. While a lot of modern games often strive for hyper-realism and high levels of graphical fidelity, older games embrace their technological constraints and turn them into strengths by developing striking and imaginative art directions and standout design that really stuck with us. And yes, there were still plenty of games back then that looked like shit, but we are going to conveniently ignore them for the purposes of this video. I also do want to call out, and I feel like I would be doing everybody a disservice if I didn't at least mention that there are current modern games, even in the AAA space, that lean heavily into art style and do it very well. Elden Ring, I think, is the most obvious as of recent, with its painterly vistas and mountains and areas that look like they could be hung up as paintings in a museum. But I also do have to say that at least within the AAA space, this level of attention to detail and strong art direction is becoming more rare than finding a stick of deodorant at a local Smash Bros tournament. Finding a stick of deodorant at a local Smash Bros tournament.
Really? A hygiene joke about Smash players.
It's an older
meme,
but it checks out.
Okay, so far we've talked a little bit about how the innovative design, the artistic direction, and the overall feel of older games led to that feeling of magic that they had. So let's go ahead and switch gears and talk a little bit about how the focus on fun and core gameplay further contributed to that feeling of magic. Back in the N64, PS1, PS2, and earlier PC era, it felt like the primary focus of game development was creating a fun, memorable, and enjoyable experience above all else. Making sure that that final product was fun and enjoyable was priority number one, or at least for the good games of that time it felt that way. And that really shows when going back and revisiting and replaying games from that era. When I think back to iconic titles like Super Mario 64, for example, the first things that come to mind for me are the tight and responsive controls, the open-ended level design, the addicting platforming, and all of the fun and cool collectibles in the game like stars, obviously, the red coins, etc. Super Mario 64 felt like it was perfectly curated to be a fun experience from the get-go, with no frills or unnecessary add-ins of any kind that felt like they were meant to pad out the game in any way. It had such a diverse set of memorable levels, charming sound design, challenges, collectibles, boss encounters even, and one of the most satisfying gameplay loops that I've ever experienced that it's permanently cemented within my adult brain right next to the AOL Instant Messenger sounds. Anyway, fresh mechanics for the time, innovative level design, and compelling gameplay loops were the big focuses that kept players hooked and made a lot of games from this era so much fun in my opinion. This is the time where we saw the birth of new and iconic titles like Metal Gear Solid, for example, Diablo 2, Ocarina of Time, Kingdom Hearts, The Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind, and plenty of other titles that were released then that are still enjoyed by modern audiences today for their gameplay ingenuity and focus on having fun. How many times am I going to say fun in this video? Subscribe right now if you're having fun. Or else. In contrast, in current year, it really does seem like a lot of these modern AAA studios are placing the majority of emphasis on anything but the actual fun gameplay. I swear, every time I go online these days, there's a huge discussion around some controversial new AAA game that had this huge budget and was supposed to be this groundbreaking event that turned out to just be some kind of soulless slop. I could drink an entire case of Miller Lite, spin around in a circle 100 times, and swing a baseball bat at the YouTube platform, and there is a 100% chance that I will hit a video talking about some new AAA game controversy with a guy soy facing in the thumbnail. Whether it's trying to push graphical fidelity to get as realistic or as next gen of a look as possible, or releasing the 50th open world game that feels emptier, more lifeless, and more boring than your average Reddit user's social circle, the trend that a lot of these modern AAA studios and games are following doesn't always seem to be primarily focused on delivering a genuinely fun experience for the player. And things have been getting even more darker lately. Much darker. Microtransactions baked into full-price games are starting to become the norm, to the point where it's starting to feel like a lot of these AAA developers and studios have lost all semblance of a soul. And on top of that, in its worst form, microtransactions have evolved into this culture of having developers and game studios making their games purposefully inconvenient so that you'll pay to skip over the actual gameplay. Some games are becoming purposefully designed where the path of least resistance is just to spend money. It's almost like these games are just created as products meant to drive retention metrics and siphon as much money as possible out of your wallet until you've developed a severe case of sunk cost fallacy-itis. Reasons like those that I just mentioned have led to a general souring towards the AAA space and most modern games in general for a lot of us video game enjoyers out there. That magic feeling that we felt when playing a lot of those titles from earlier generations, like I mentioned, has all but subsided for a lot of us. The fun, purely gameplay-driven experiences of those games provided a level of lasting enjoyment and the feeling of satisfaction that seems to be harder to come by these days in modern titles. And I'm going to start getting a little bit derailed here, but I feel like I have to talk about this. As much as I love and use digital platforms like Steam Steam, for example, does it bother anybody else that we technically aren't owning our games anymore? Technically, we just own the license to play the games, which I suppose can just be revoked at any time for any reason, technically. Whatever happened to owning a product and getting to do whatever you wanted with that product? In the era of the N64, PS1, and PS2, local split-screen multiplayer and co-op experiences were at the heart of gaming, helping to foster a strong sense of community among players and oftentimes among friends. It was common to have friends or family, or maybe just you and the weird neighborhood kids, sit down in front of the TV for intense split-screen matches or multiplayer campaigns. It was a pretty strong staple of the gaming experience at that time. Titles like GoldenEye, Mario Kart 64, and the Halo series provided endless hours of shared joy and camaraderie. These sessions were more than just playing games. They were like little social events where laughter, fun, competition, and teamwork forged lasting bonds with your friends. The physical presence of actually being there playing together, plus the face-to-face interaction during the gameplay, created a unique social dynamic which is pretty much irreplaceable by modern means like playing online. This local multiplayer experience cultivated a sense of togetherness and community that many people who enjoyed games look fondly back on. For a lot of us, it was one of the main defining aspects for many of our early gaming experiences. I still remember having summer off school and planning out brackets for Super Smash Bros. Melee tournaments with me and my friends, with completely made up rule sets and a bracket that made absolutely no sense. Playing with Pokeballs only turned on seemed like the best competitive viability option at that time. As time went on, consoles and PCs became more powerful, and as technology became more advanced, the gaming industry experienced a significant shift towards online multiplayer. This transition opened up new possibilities for connecting with players worldwide, allowing for more diverse, large-scale, and just generally more expansive gaming experiences in the multiplayer space. Monumental game franchises like World of Warcraft or the Halo series or Call of Duty or even Fortnite Battle Pass revolutionized how players interacted with one another, creating these vast online gaming communities and these newfound competitive environments. However, this shift also generally changed the nature of social interactions in gaming. While the onset of online multiplayer provided a newfound sense of convenience in that you could play at any time with anybody, whether it's a friend or a stranger from across the world, it also introduced both the elements of anonymity and that distance of not actually being there in person. Those in-person, immediate face-to-face connections with local multiplayer were replaced by a virtual online experience, which definitely has its own merits and its place within the multiplayer gaming space, but I think it's safe to say that it lacks that sense of community and bonding experience of actually sitting there and playing with some of your friends. I'm sure a lot of us remember those schoolyard rumors of the original Pokemon games where there were hidden secrets like Mew being under the truck by the SS Anne, or the famous rare candy duplication glitch that definitely worked but also completely fucked up your game. That was originally how people would share their gaming experiences and share different kinds of rumors or secrets that they may have heard. Fast forward just a little bit further and gaming discussions started to take place on dedicated online forums. Think sites like Game FAQs or...
Hey guys, this is Post filming Grass Toucher here. So was this shit called Game Facts or Game FAQs? I can't remember. Honestly, I'm a little bit embarrassed. If I said it wrong, go ahead and let me know what it's called in the comments.
Really early community-run gaming websites. The forums back then seemed much more niche and tight-knit, often fostering a sense of belonging and mutual respect among the members who posted there who shared the same interest. Discussions tended to be more in-depth, with people sharing their thoughts, feelings, strategies, secrets, all of that fun stuff, and really enjoying the process of having this information readily available. Fast forward to the modern day, and most, if not all, of these discussions have migrated to larger platforms like Reddit, Discord, or other forms of social media. And while these modern platforms offer a larger reach and that instant connectivity where we can discuss things with one another, the nature of those interactions kind of feels like it's changed. What used to feel like this tight-knit community of friends, enthusiasts, and people who were just generally there to have a discussion has since evolved to fleeting conversations or clickbait or shit posting. Little things too, like the upvote and and downvote system from Reddit can lead to a lot more polarized discussion where you only really get one side of something. Despite all the changes, I think each version of sharing gaming experiences, whether that's, back at the schoolyard, in these more dedicated online forums, or what we have now in the modern day, they all have their different merits, and they still boil down to bringing people together and having a way to share what they're passionate about. But if I'm injecting my own personal opinion into this video, I do think that I prefer that older style where at least the online discourse was more kind of sanctioned to those tight-knit communities. And tying back to this video's theme of feeling that magic in those older games and that older era of gaming, that feeling of shared community and having a more tight-knit and niche space that has since pretty much passed really did lend itself to making gaming in general feel a little bit more magical, for lack of a better term. And it's something that I'm glad that myself and many of you probably watching were able to experience and that we can still talk about today. And also, I did just want to mention this and make it clear. I still do love modern gaming, and I think that there are a lot of quality titles that are still being released today. And for me, that's games like Elden Ring and of course the Dark Souls series, the Monster Hunter franchise, Deep Rock Galactic is another good one, Hades, Doom Eternal, even Risk of Rain 2 are all examples of what I would consider excellent modern titles. So it's not all doom and gloom out there. Stay positive. There's still plenty of good games being released. I think it's no secret that gaming back in that earlier era had unique qualities that made the titles at that time feel so unique and memorable and still cherished today. And while I think that there is a really large nostalgia component for this era that shouldn't go unacknowledged, many of these games still stand the test of time due to their solid qualities. Mainly the gameplay, imaginative worlds, and innovative designs for the time. Technical limitations sparked creativity that led us to some of the most unique and visually striking games of that time and still today. The focus on art direction and visual design over purely graphical fidelity gave us timeless classics that still captivate players today. That emphasis on gameplay and just making things fun created unique experiences that we all still look back on fondly. And while it's clear that the enduring appeal and fond memories that we have from titles of this era can be attributed in some part to nostalgia, I think that genuine magic that the games from that time held can't be ignored. These games were crafted with a passion and creativity that transcended their technological constraints, and they delivered experiences that felt truly special. Whether it was the intensity and fun of those couch co-op sessions with your friends, the joy of exploring imaginative worlds, or just the simple pleasure of a well-designed gameplay loop, these elements combine to create a sense of magic that still resonates with people today. So as we conclude our little journey down memory lane, I'd actually love to hear from you guys. If you've got any memorable experiences, cherished memories, or just stories about any games from this era, I'd love to hear it in the comments. If you liked the video and made it all the way through, first of all, thank you. Please go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Like the video, helps out a lot. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next one.